Hello and welcome to the Road to Africa Investment Forum. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, it's the second time this conference has been held here in South Africa, an effort to draw investors to the continent. It will once again be held at the Sandton Convention Centre between the 11th and 13th of November, and we will be covering it all live here on CNBC Africa. Now, this was the first time the conference was held. There's pictures here of the first time the conference was held in 2018. I was there covering it with our team. Now, nearly 2,000 people were there from 87 countries. The African Development Bank, organising the conference, said there was interest in 49 deals secured at the conference worth an estimated $38.7 billion. So with just over 10 days to go, what can we expect this year? So I've got an esteemed panel here, starting with Josephine Ngure, the Deputy or Acting Director General of the RDG, of the African Development Bank, I've got Ronnie Ntuli, a private investor from Telo. And then we got Yuri Swart, the CEO of the African Infrastructure Investment Managers, all people with a stake in the system as we head towards the big conference next week. To start off with you, Josephine, what exactly came out of last year's conference in bricks and mortar? That's a question a lot of people will be asking.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me this afternoon. As you know, we had a very successful inaugural Africa Investment Forum here in South Africa, held at the Sandton Convention Center. As you mentioned, we had over 2,000 delegates attending, and I think this was evidence of what we have always been saying, that Africa is an interesting investment destination. During the investment forum, what we did was we held boardrooms for operations that we have identified as interesting. And we looked at 63 deals which were worth almost $47 billion. And of those, we had very interesting boardroom discussions, and we had interest from investors that was expressed for 49 deals worth approximately $39 billion.
So Ronnie, you were there as a foreign investor. In fact, we saw each other there last year. How was it for you? I mean, you're out there looking for deals. It's not the easiest time to be a person looking for investment. What did it do for you last year?
Yeah, so, you know, the Africa Investment Forum, Chris, for us was a seminal platform because it's an African platform, not about talk and speeches. It's a transactional platform. It's very definitive. For us, we, along with all our partners, attended, and one of our international partners out of Germany, believe it or not, said it was arguably the single, and this is a person who's mature in commerce, has been in business for over 30 years, professional career, said arguably one of the most successful business trips he had ever been on. So for me, we had a view as Africans, but to hear it from a large global institution, and the big achievement for us is at the Africa Investment Forum 2018, we launched our railway joint venture with Deutsche Bahn. And since then, we've gotten the attention of a number of governments on the continent of Africa who recognize that, and capital investors and advisors potentially to what we're trying to do, who recognize what we're bringing to the market. And to have the opportunity to do that in one single platform, it's really a great consolidator of commercial interest on the continent of Africa. I think it's very well put together.
Yuri, you're the infrastructure is your game. How did you tackle the conference, and how did you felt the aftermath went?
Well, pretty much the way Ronnie's saying, there's a single platform where you get together with everybody you need to see. And, you know, we operate on a geographically very diverse continent, and we have investors from across the world. And inevitably what that means is that 3/4 of your time is spent trying to connect with these people. And yeah, you have everybody in one place. It's like any other of these conferences. You need to be have the nous to sort of weed out and decide which are the meaningful conversations that you need to have and that you can have. because the reality is there are a couple of people there who are floating some ideas that are just never going to fly, and you need to see through those. But it's such a useful get together of everybody you need to see.
So back to where we started on this discussion, Josephine, I ask you, what will we be able to take binoculars and see in terms of what comes out of this, where that money is going? I mean, you said last year there were billions gathered for investment. What will actually be going up in bricks and mortar?
Yes, so I think if you look at the investment needs on the continent, one of the things we have always been saying is that we do not have enough money for infrastructure. And infrastructure gaps have been holding back growth of this continent. It is true that we've come a long way. A lot of governments on this continent have spent a lot of money investing in infrastructure, which partly explains why we see debt levels going up in a number of our countries. And it is time now for us to be able to see the productive sectors using this. So one of the things we would like to see is more value addition across the continent. We want to see people tapping into the agricultural sector. We want to see agro-processing. We want to be able to also tap into renewable energy as a way of supporting Africa's industrialization goal. And all these are things that are being tracked as part of what we're calling the deal tracker, the part of the Africa Investment Forum, the part of the platform that's really tracking the deals. Once we take them to the boardroom, there's a team that follows these deals through to closure and also works with the various investors and developers to make sure that we see the end of these projects. But I would say that overall, we want to see more private sector investment across the continent. Obviously, different countries on the continent are at different levels in terms of private sector activity. You look at South Africa here, there's a lot more vibrancy in terms of the private sector. But we also want to see companies moving beyond their borders. We want to see more of South African companies going into other African countries, bringing in their know-how and helping to promote private sector investment across the continent, I would say.
How much are you feeling, Ronnie? You've had a lot of experience in international business and traveling. I mean, there used to be, one of the problems of these conferences, a lot of people used to come here and say, oh, we didn't realize what was going on here, how much there is going on. Yeah. Is there still that, or have people moved up another level?
Yeah. So it's a very interesting question, because there's still, I know of a couple of industrial platforms that have built themselves simply, and financial platforms actually, that have built themselves simply on the Africa arbitrage. Because global perception of African risk versus the reality of African risk are two different things. So, but excitingly, that is literally the opportunity that presents itself to us as Africans who understand the continent, who spend time on the continent. Africa risk, I think, is still hugely mispriced, but it's gonna be for us as African entrepreneurs, industrialists, to close that risk gap. And I think it's the point that Josephine raises, which is African companies, we have to start having an outlook of African multinationals, companies that go across borders on the continent, because definitively we understand the continent better than anybody else. And the continent, in my mind, still represents amongst the biggest opportunities on planet Earth. We are at very early stages of development. And that opportunity and that arbitrage, I think, is prime for Africans to explore.
And Yuri,
just to add to what Ronnie said there, I mean, we are not in the industrialization piece that follows on from the infrastructure. We play in the infrastructure tram lines, and we've been doing that for, it's been around for 20 years doing just that. Yeah. But to give examples to this risk perception versus reality, I mean, if you go and look at global, and so we're much more project-based than sort of building big corporates. If you look at global defaults, and you look at the African record, you'll be very surprised by the numbers. Africa's got a better record than most. Secondly, when you do these projects, when we started out in South Africa as doing project finance, it was done on a very robust sort of basis, and kind of the world was there too. But if you look at where projects have gone internationally, guys are having to gear more than what you should be to squeeze that last little bit. You know, renewable energy projects internationally often rely on government incentives, tax incentives, and you saw the Spanish example where, you know, when they decide these incentives shouldn't be there anymore, that's what happens. Whereas in Africa, what you see is what you get. We're still transacting on a very robust basis.
Correct.
The moving parts are not stretched to the extreme, if I can call it that. So, you know, this theme of, I know it's become a little bit of a jargon for all of us in the industry to say, you know, the risk perception is much greater than the reality. But there's very concrete evidence of that.
But the work, the work that Yuri and them are doing is critically important, because I think if you consolidate the point he made and the point that Josephine makes, the need to place industrial capacity on the continent and start industrial processing is very difficult to achieve unless you have the infrastructure to plug source and industry, so to say. Yeah. So the drive to place infrastructure capacity on the continent is important. Let me use the railway sector, or let's talk transportation and logistics more broadly, which is the intervention that we are making. If you look at the pattern, and everybody knows this, the pattern is still an old pattern of from a mine to a port. You are not going to achieve industrialization on that infrastructure pattern. So what you have to start thinking about is beyond corridors that go from mine to port. How do you start developing networks domestically or regionally within the continent of Africa that move product from a mine to a processing plant, for example? But then again, in the infrastructure space, you have to ask yourself the question of, do you have the power to do the energy to do that industrial processing? So infrastructure is incredibly important if we're going to achieve the point that Josephine raises about industrialization.
Josephine, I could just talk a little bit more about risk here. I mean, for a number of years, the African Development Bank has been trying to get around this problem by blending, trying to take the risk out for private investors here. I know public-private partnerships is a very fashionable phrase these days, but the actual nitty-gritty of that, how's it been faring in the recent years?
Well, you're right. You know, we've tried as the African Development Bank, as a AAA rated institution. We've really worked hard to try and leverage our rating to bring reasonably priced resources onto the continent. But what we have realized is that that in itself is not enough for the ambitions that the continent has for itself. And this is why platforms like the Africa Investment Forum have been set up, because what we want to do now is start, as was said, start first bringing people onto the continent. They come here to South Africa and they see for themselves what's happening on the continent. We keep saying there is a lot of companies that are not African that are making a lot of money on this continent. In fact, some have been here for decades and they're not going. I remember when I grew up, I still see those companies, the multinational companies I used to see in my country. So we do want to give people this sense of comfort that actually you can invest in Africa as a private investor and there are returns, as was just said. But hand in hand with that, we do realize that government also have a role to play. And so as we try to promote this, we are in dialogue with governments, trying to address those business enabling environment issues that need to be addressed to bring in the private sector. You know, it's not just the risk perception, it's a big part of it, but we also know that there are issues we need to address. So by bringing together the government and the private sector in a platform, in a forum like the Africa Investment Forum, what we try to do is really fast track some of these critical investments and trying to get governments to commit to remove the bottlenecks that are standing in the way of these investments. And I think also the core guarantee platform that we have, we are establishing as part of the Africa Investment Forum will go a long way in mitigating some of the real risks that exist for some of the projects. We do know that, of course, there are some countries, for example, on the continent where people want to get extra comfort even beyond the policy commitments. And that is where we would want to see our guarantee instruments inside the bank, but in the co-guarantee platform being used to promote the private sector investment.
So Ronnie, I ask you as a private investor, I mean, there are these mechanisms and guarantees available for private people like yourself. Okay. Why isn't everyone doing it then?
Doing it as in availing it, or
Availing,
doing it as, or
going
tapping?
into these public-private partnerships that as supposedly the future.
Yeah. So, look, I think we spend a lot of time on the ground in different countries on the continent. The one thing I can say without fear of contradiction is there's a changing paradigm in the mindset of African governments, right? And I say that in the most positive way you can imagine. African governments are becoming more pragmatic about how do we actually deliver development. We as a state on our own will not be able to do so. Clear realization and clear movement in that direction. So I think there's a realization also that the best instrument to utilize is public-private partnerships, one way or another. And a lot more for big infrastructure projects that we are dealing with on the continent. The governments are saying, you know, I was really stunned. I was sitting with a very progressive, I think you'll guess which country it is, very progressive government on the continent who were very clear. They were like, look, what you are doing will support development in our country. We want you to make profit. That's clear for us. We want the development impact. There's no saying, no, you're making too much profit. But the reason we are doing what we're doing is, yes, to deliver development, but also we want an economic return so that we are sustainable and we can invest elsewhere. But that sort of pragmatic, definitive, we're not apologetic that you are going to make profit, is a refreshing paradigm as a private sector investor. And they're accepting public-private partnerships, and they're accepting in times that it has to be operated and managed for a period of time by the private sector, train and help locals gain those skills, and we have no problem. So there's a great progression, I think, in the leadership of African government.
I think in my mind I'm in East Africa somewhere. I can't really quite say where it is, but actually
That's closer to the middle.
the finance minister of that very country, he also said to me, he said, listen, I asked him about this thing about foreign investment, he says, as long as you're doing something legal, he said, it develops the country, we don't care.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's a remarkable country. In fact, it's in a minority. Other countries, maybe including this one, South Africa, should get behind that. Are you seeing that or not, Yuri?
Well, we certainly see a lot more progressive thought, if I can call it that, across the board. I think there's a strong realization, and there have been a couple of events. Let's not forget the Arab Spring, etc., recent past. A couple of events, the increasing use of social media across the board. It becomes more and more difficult for people to hide behind non-delivery. But I think there's an increasing understanding of the fact that whilst we sell the demographic dividend as a huge positive for Africa, it's also our biggest challenge going into the future. And if we don't address that and get people busy, we actually do have no future. And that's just coming through more and more. So, as Ronnie says, the governments in Africa do not have the resources to address the infrastructure development space in full. Obviously, they've got a role to play too. There's a lot of infrastructure that's not commercially viable, but still needs to be done. So it is a joint rollout, if I can call it that. With regards to addressing the real challenges and the products that are required, you speak to so many international investors who tell you that it's not if, it's when. It's not if, it's when, but they keep kicking for touch. We really see everything happening, but whereas if we start introducing guarantee products, so that it becomes a no-brainer for the institutional investor in Europe to invest in Africa, because actually there's someone who stands at the front of the queue in risk, and therefore the rating of my debt is acceptable, and then I think we'll start seeing more and more flows. We currently still use foreign political risk insurance products on every single in every single project. it's often a sensitive thing, because why do you need political risk insurance against my country? Let's just get the thing mobilized. It will go away in time.
Yeah.
But, you know, accept some of these guarantee products, etc., in the short term.
Maybe there'll come a day, Josephine, when this political risk insurance won't be needed. I mean, when you look at actually what's happening around the world at the moment, a lot of countries in Africa are a lot safer than the rest of the world combined. I mean, do you think they'll ever get to that day, you think, Josephine?
I definitely think we'll get to that day. You know, I think there was a part where our government was so busy dealing with very high levels of poverty. And in my lifetime, I remember that there was little room for even thinking, as you're saying, about how do we begin to partner with the private sector. I think the progression that's being seen now is really evidence that Africa has made progress. We've made progress in fighting poverty. We've made progress on the democratic space. Yes, we are not yet there, but we can begin now to think a bit more strategically. How do we accelerate our growth? And how do we drive growth ourselves? We say charity begins at home. And so you are seeing a lot of governments. That's why you had 8 heads of states at the Africa Investment Forum last year. They are very clear that they want to move in a certain direction, and it's not a direction where the government is doing everything. But we understand that capacity has been and will continue to be a challenge. Negotiating with the private sector, when it is government, they need more support. And this is why we again have things like the Africa Legal Support Facility, which helps governments to be able to negotiate fair deals with the private sector. Because I think there were deals that just didn't go very well in the beginning when the whole idea of the privatization came up, and a lot of governments developed cold feet. So now they have more confidence, they've seen success, and you know, success is breeding on success. So eventually we will get to that point. We definitely will get to that point. Africa has enough wealth, it has enough human capital, and it has enough determination to get to that point.
Just one last very quick question of you, Ronnie, before we go to the break. One thing I did ask the finance minister in East Africa, I said, are you not concerned at all where foreign investors will have more of a stake in your country than the people of your country do? And he said, no, we're not worried about that. But do you think there's ever going to be a tipping point, you think, for African countries where perhaps they feel that they're being dominated rather than invested in?
Yeah, and I think Josephine raises a really important point in that, you know, the balance, let me call it the negotiating balance between the capacity that the state has versus experienced single industry, global multinational has in an engagement at times is unbalanced. But you know, I think collectively around the table, we as Africans are also getting a little bit wiser, and I think we are suggesting to our governments that don't accept the rape and pillagers. We don't need to. We don't. You know, we don't have to interact with kind of the last. If you can even call
people
them
on the list.
Okay. Sorry, carry on.
But we'll, I mean, governance, we're all addressing that up front.
That's
these
correct.
days. And you know,
correct.
in terms of sustainability of your projects, as the private sector, or the foreigner, so to speak, you're a fool if you think you can go in there and rape and pillage these days. Because no matter how strong you think your contract is, it will unwind on you in 5 years.
Sure.
Because people catch up.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of recent examples on the continent where people thought, you know, let me give you a real example. So we are now, even though we have a very competitive suite of products, and very limited in availability globally, not just on the continent, we, not the governments, we insist on the governments following proper process to award. Do you know why we do that? We do that because the quick entry will definitively mean quick exit. And it's not the business we're in. It's not about we managed to kind of quickly convince a government to agree with us. It's about let's follow the thoroughest of, if such a word exists, of due process, so that whether there's change of administration or whatever consequence, what we have stands the test of time. That's why we have that discipline.
Okay, Ronnie, hold that thought there. We're going to go to a quick break now. And when we come back, we're going to be speaking to one of the big stories of the year. It's been described as one of the biggest stories of the century, the Africa Free Trade Area. Do stay with us on this special broadcast. Hello, I'm Chris Bishop, the editor of CNBC Africa, and you're with the Road to Africa Investment Forum. We're going live across 48 countries in the continent, and still with me is my esteemed panel, Josephine Ngure, the Deputy DG, but acting DG at the moment of the African Development Bank, Southern Africa. We've got Ronnie Ntuli, the Chairman of TELO, and Yuri Swart, the CEO of the Africa Infrastructure Investment Managers. Thank you very much for being with me on this day. And as I said before the break, the African Free Trade Area, which is a program on its own, and it's really come to prominence since the last investment conference. Josephine, what are your hopes for it?
It's very exciting to start with. And the African Development Bank Group has been working with countries on the road towards the milestone that was achieved. You know, intra-Africa trade is very low. If you compare it to the rest of the world, it's really insignificant. And there are many reasons. You know, we talked about the infrastructure, we can talk about harmonization of trade policies and so on. But we need to have the commitment to have free trade on the continent for us to be able to jumpstart many economies on this continent. You know, one of the things every private investor, and when you can confirm, looks at when they're investing is where is the market. Now, yes, we do have some big markets on the continent, but we do have a lot of small markets on the continent. And consolidating this market creates opportunities far beyond what we've been talking about in the last 2 years. So for us, we are expecting to see much more intra-Africa trade. We expect African countries and African investors and businessmen and women to start looking at the potential on the continent. It is always very good when we talk about diversification of our export markets to look beyond our boundaries. But I think for a long time, we've always almost looked beyond the African continent.
Correct.
And it's time for us to start thinking, how do we actually tap into the markets that are just next door? It's going to be cheaper, it's actually going to be more efficient. And so we're really excited about this, and we are hoping that we will be working with our regional member countries and working through the Africa Investment Platform to remove the soft aspects that are stumbling blocks for trade. We know there is a lot of non-tariff barriers, but we also know there are tariff barriers, and we do want to work together to make sure that we can double, triple the intra-Africa trade numbers that we have, which are barely 14% at present.
Sure. As a private businessman, Ronnie, I mean, a lot of the smaller countries do still fear that they might be swamped or have goods dumped on them because of this thing. How far are these fears justified?
How do I answer that as a private investor?
I don't know. You talk to a lot of people. You're in business across the continent.
You're asking me to dabble into politics, which I am unable to do. No, look, I think, Chris, to say fully agree with the points that Josephine is saying. It's, you know, for lack of a more impactful word, it's seminal, I think, for the continent of Africa. It really is. And I was having a discussion with a colleague, and my view is that it is probably the single most important development since independence for most of our countries. I think the opportunity to consolidate the African market is huge. I think, but for me, the paradigm that it shifts fundamentally. Yes, I agree. The intra-Africa trade number is very small. I think now we're hovering around 14-15%, somewhere there. If you look at other regions, I mean, Europe being the most successful at trade within Europe. But the big point for me is that it shifts the continental paradigm away from it's a place of extraction to it's a market, right? Which is really the catalyst that develops economies. 2050, we're heading for 2 billion Africans. That's a real consumer market. That's a real consumer market. So, but also importantly then, because of the magnitude of the opportunity, it incentivizes productive capacity on the continent. So what it'll then do is productive capacity on the continent will create jobs, will develop skills, will create disposable income. There's taxation, governments suddenly have more revenue, and people are able to buy goods. And that's the catalyst at the end of the day for economic development. We can talk about all other things. And that's when the population, size of population moves away from being a risk to then becoming an opportunity. So for me, completely seminal. We all our countries have to move forward to implement it. I think it's...
And then, Yuri, we come to another issue, infrastructure. I mean, I've probably read all the same reports that you've all read, but, you know, there's a problem in some countries, the rail gauges are different, there's not enough roads, there's a dearth of electricity. How is this huge infrastructure gap going to be filled?
You know, I think where I've got to over 19, 20 years of playing in this space is the old thing about how do you eat an elephant bit by bit, you know, and I think what we have done in the past is maybe sometimes planned on projects that were just too big, you know, so you're actually asking the corner shop to guarantee, you know, something which is the equivalent of the JSE top 10 size type of thing, you know, if so you know, you've just got to start addressing each need as it comes across in a package that's doable. I'll just give you an example. Mali, we've done a 90 megawatt power station in Mali. Now, we would sit here going, a 90 megawatt baseload power station, come on, you must be nuts. It's just too small a project. In Mali, it's a quarter of the grid. The impact and that you have, and then you're going to do it in a region which is the biggest area for migrants across the Mediterranean. Then you start looking at what the sustainable impact of just taking a small bite and getting it done is. With regards to the agreement, that's an exciting place for me in the infrastructure space. You know, over the years we've had investments in, for example, a rail, and I won't mention countries. But you would get border posts are some of the most notoriously inefficient places for good reason. Now, this takes one really big reason away for making it inefficient. So we would transport, we went across 3 countries, 2 borders with a train, railway line, 2 days to the first border, 7 to 14 days at the border. 2 days to get to the next border, 7 to 14 days at the border, 1.5 days to port. You know, because obviously they're literally, I mean, border posts are one of the most notorious places for graft. Now, this goes a long way to taking away one of the big reasons for keeping people at border posts and actually opening border posts. And actually, you know what, there's no reason to stop the train anymore, type of thing. The other fantastic development for me is if the African countries have been able to agree on free trade, there may be an agreement now on cross-border infrastructure projects become a reality, which has also been a big challenge for us historically. You know, you can build something from here to the border, but then what? You've got to get to a separate set of agreements with the guys on the other side. Now maybe we'll start looking at integrated infrastructure projects.
How ready do you think are African governments to open up their borders in the way we're alluding to here? I mean, I read a lot of stories on the East Africa community. I thought it was amazing what was happening there, even talking about political union in that area. But it seems there's been some border issues since then which have knocked the whole process back. How ready do you think African governments are to say, okay, let's open the borders and start trade?
I think they are ready. And as you said, East Africa is a good example. You know, I come from Kenya, and I knew when people were talking about opening borders and being able to go across the border with your ID card, they thought that maybe people from Kenya or from another country were going to flood the other country. And none of that happened. So part of it is psychological, just pretty much as we were talking about risk in Africa. There is this perception of risk that people from the other side of the border are going to run to your country. Right? So I think, yes, there is a psychological barrier to cross. And I think the fact that we are seeing now countries committing to the free trade area, that for me is a sign that we are beginning to cross the psychological barriers. And at the end of the day, if you think about the program for infrastructure development in Africa, which the African Development Bank was championing with the AU and has champions of heads of states, it is one big program that looks at cross-border infrastructure. Yes, there are many different elements to consider in this, but I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to give now added impetus in the development of these programs, projects. We are already working on some of them. But then if you're working, as you're saying, on a cross-border road and one country has to invest a lot of money and they're probably not seeing the economic rate of return as looking that good, then it holds back. So in a way, the small markets are also holding back investment in infrastructure. And my hope is that we are now going to be able to move faster with the program that program for infrastructure development in Africa. We should also be moving ahead faster now with the Africa industrialization strategy. We need to think very strategically about how the different countries fit into the puzzle of this industrialization strategy, so that all countries are not trying to do the same things and tap into the same potential. So I know it will take time, but I think the signs are there and they are positive signs. Probably what happens is we make progress and then maybe there is a little setback, as you said, and everybody talks about the setback and people forget about the progress we had made. So I think part of it is also for us to tell the story, to give the good examples of where opening borders has worked, to talk about Mauritius, where people have been able to go in and out a lot and look what that does to the economy. Talk about the countries that are now giving free access, visa-free access or visa at entry, and show that those risks are not there. Maybe we need to play a big role in spreading that message as well. And the Africa Integration Index, the Regional Integration Index, the Openness Index, that the African Development Bank does, is part of an effort to now spread that message. So now you can see country X has opened, and you know the country hasn't just been invaded by people from all over the world. So it's a yes.
But isn't that a psychological thing that the continent will come eventually? I mean, if you look at what happened in Europe, people thought that it'll never happen, that there'll be complete free movement of people and goods, and it did happen. It took, it took 50, 60 years for it to happen. And I don't know, I mean, and again, some of the fears, when I was reading Nigeria's objections to the original idea, and I thought to myself, well, actually, people are sitting out there waiting with all these stuff. They want to flood Nigeria as soon as the borders are open. I don't know. What's the feeling you're getting from the business side?
But you seem to have a view first.
No, I just think we need to change the rhetoric from will it work to what do we need to do to make it work. That's because, the first step is, at least there's an agreement, which is, that's a huge step. Without that, we are just talking about theory. Now we've got something. Now, what are the impediments? Let's get them out the way.
That's correct.
Rather than the approach of, basket case can never work.
No, sure.
I think we, as you say, we almost need to become, the spokespeople for
and I think
for making it happen.
I think also African leaders are going to have to lead. No longer will it just be a title. You're really going to have to lead because, look around the world. There's many countries that are small countries. There's many countries that are without resources. There's many countries that are what you could perceive as 101 disadvantages who've created a destiny for themselves. So African countries, big and small, will have a role to play in the African trade pattern, one way or another. But African leaders will have to lead. And you have to, I think you have to huddle up and shape a destiny for your jurisdiction, so to say, and say within this, where is the destiny for our country? And I'm not convinced that as we interpret benefits or advantages and disadvantages today is what will play out. I think the countries that so-called lead may be the countries that will be in a future disadvantaged position. But it's going to be about leadership. I really think it's going to be about leadership.
What's the feeling you're getting, Josephine? I mean, you obviously interact with a lot of the political leadership on this continent. Do you think people are getting round to the idea and ready to lead, as Ronnie says?
I think the evidence is that this is happening. One of the challenges I think that often we come across is that you have cycles that align to election cycles, right? So in the past, there was a bit of uncertainty if we move to a new administration, what's going to happen to the investment plans that we have, what's going to happen to policy. But I think if you look in the recent past, we haven't had many disruptions in that space. I can tell you, we work in countries on the basis of usually 5-year country development strategies. So we would formulate that, and sometimes it might align with the election period, sometimes it doesn't. And then you would expect to see big disruptions if there is a big change in policy, especially. I think there is more predictability now. I think there is general consensus across the different political divides that there are certain priorities, including improving the quality of life of your citizens. I think governance has improved, so citizens are able to hold governments more accountable. So are more able to hold them accountable, which means that you can't just change policy, just because you want to change policy. And I think all these things are coming together, and what we are seeing now is, over time, an improvement in the level of commitment to take things forward. What I would say to add to what Ronnie just said, yes, leaders need to lead. I would say that the commitment to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is the first step. And I think for me, and I hope, it's just the beginning and an acknowledgement that once we agree to this, there is a number of things we need to do to get the benefits that have to come from the agreement. It is not the final goal is not the agreement. Okay? It's not making it effective. It's getting to a result which is going to benefit each and every African on this continent. And I think once we see that being taken into account, for example, in the development plans of countries as we move forward, and taking into account what I said, we see more consistency now in the development plans and goals and policy. I'm sure that will fall into place.
I mean, Ronnie, what do you think is the prize? I mean, just imagine if this thing is driven forward, as we've said, maybe 10, maybe 20 years, I don't know how long it'll take. What do you think, how do you think Africans will see that prize there, and in terms of the way the continent is and the kind of wealth and industrialization that is on the continent?
Yeah. So I have a definitive point of view. Every generation has a mission. There was the generation that began the revolutionary movements. There's the generation that went to the bush, went to jail, got exiled, and delivered independence. There's our generation. The task of this generation is less political, more economic, I think. And I think if you hum in further on that, I think the task of this generation is we have to deliver sustainable livelihood for the average African. That's our task. So the prize, I think on the other end, into a more distant future of the Africa Free Trade Agreement, for example, is how do we use that platform to achieve that outcome? That's the prize, from where I sit.
And ultimately, the measurable will be jobs.
That's correct.
And
That's
you
correct.
know, if you look through the SDGs, which we these
That's
days
correct.
track on every investment we make, you know, yes, sure, the SDGs were driven to government, but we use that
Yeah.
framework. And you're measuring constantly. Are
That's
you
correct.
creating jobs? Are
That's
you
correct.
creating a better life? Are you
That's
looking after the climate? Are you
That's correct.
providing basic education,
That's
etc.?
correct.
And these are focus points for us
That's
now,
correct.
and they're measurable focus points.
Which is why I consolidate it
Yes.
as sustainable,
Sustainable
livelihood
livelihood
for
for all.
every African.
Sure.
That's what we have
Yeah.
to do.
And just one other question before we move on to the final phase of this interview. The AFDB, what are you going to be trying to do in the next few years to push this agenda forward?
So we will continue what we have been doing in terms of dialoguing with the government to remove all barriers to trade. We will continue building capacity in the different areas of government where it's needed to support trade. We obviously are going to continue doing a lot of infrastructure investment, because we know that trade is not going to happen if goods cannot move from one part of the continent to the other. But I feel that, and the timing, if you think about it, of the launch of the Africa Investment Forum and the ability of investors from across the globe to come and take advantage of the potential future the opportunities offered by this free trade area is really amazing, right? But I think one of the things that we really value is our relationship with governments. We consider ourselves an honest broker. We consider ourselves a trusted partner. And we will see our role as one where we will be there to help governments think through some of those sensitive things that need to be overcome as we move forward, right? So there are areas that are a bit more obvious to deal with. There are other areas where governments want to sit back and they want to really get some advice from a very trusted, partner. And we see ourselves playing an increasingly important role in that regard. Really to make sure, to come back to what you said, that even small setbacks that happen, because obviously I don't expect it's going to be a smooth ride all the way. If anybody expects that, we really are already setting ourselves for failure. We know it's going to be a process, and we need to make sure that every step of the way, whatever happens, it's not read as a failure. It's not understood that, it was launched and we all said it wasn't going to work. We need to go in with the mentality that it's going to work. We're going to work together to solve the problems that we might come across along the way, and that's our job.
Just one last thing, and I'll throw it open to all three of you. I was speaking to the Reserve Bank Governor, Seche Kanyako, at the World Economic Forum, and he had a theory that it might be easier than we all think for the settlement system and doing business. He said you've got the SADC settlement system, you've got East Africa, West Africa. If you link those three up, you've got a settlement system that'll work from here effectively to the Mediterranean Sea. I don't know. Do you see anything like that coming?
He's infinitely more qualified than I am.
And maybe more optimistic than you are. I don't know.
Look, in theory, it is the case. I think what we will have to do is address exactly these challenges. Where are the vulnerabilities and the fears within the system that need to be addressed? Technically, certainly the technological world is catching up, or is probably ahead of the system. So in theory, it should be infinitely doable. But we need to address all the hurdles that we have along the way.
Okay, well, lastly, I'm afraid we're running out of time. Very briefly, just 10 days to go to this great conference. What do you want to see from it? Just starting with you, Josephine, very briefly.
I was really excited by what I saw last year. As we all said, it surpassed our expectations. I actually chaired a number of the boardroom sessions, and the enthusiasm that we had from investors and developers was very exciting. So I am hoping that we will see more of that enthusiasm. We will see people who come now much more prepared to have dialogue. I'm hoping to see government around the table as well to really come and offer the comfort that we're looking for some of the complex deals, so that we can really start moving them forward.
Ronnie.
Ditto.
Well, what more can we say? Yuri?
I would. You used my line, Ronnie. But I certainly would want to see increased advocacy for the African continent as the primary, deliverable here. Secondly, moving more and more into the let's not talk about it, let's execute it space, and to get more people into the bucket of, oh goodness, it's no longer not if, but when, it's we better be there. That's what I'd like to achieve.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for on this Road to Africa Investment Forum. Thanks to my esteemed panel, Josephine Ngure, the Acting Director General of the FDB Southern Africa, Ronnie Ntuli, the Chairman of TELO, and Yuri Swart, the CEO of African Infrastructure Investment Managers. That's all we've got time for. From myself, Chris Bishop and the team, it's goodbye.